Okay, everybody, we're ready for a brand new week, and this week we're going to be talking about the presidency. The presidency, this is actually a slightly shorter lecture, should be a slightly shorter lecture than the last couple of weeks because I divide the executive branch into two different series of lectures. The first is on the president, and the second is on the rest of the executive branch, the other executive branch officials. So we should be able to divide that up and hopefully have a little bit of a lighter week this week. So this week, as I said, we're talking about the president. We're talking about Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. Now, we talked about the three branches of government. We started with the legislative branch. The legislative branch is the first branch of government. It's found in Article 1. It makes the laws. So they start everything off. They get the ball rolling. Then we move to Article 2, the executive branch. They execute the laws. They enforce the laws. Then finally we'll end up with Article 3, which is the judiciary. They interpret and apply the law. So we finished Article 1. We're moving on to Article 2. Going to talk about the executive branch. And Article 2 starts very clearly. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Now, this is that vesting clause. We looked at it for the executive branch. We'll look at it for the judiciary. But these are all very important. And what's important about this is, where is that executive power vested? Is it vested in the executive branch? No, it's actually vested in the president. The president of the United States is the executive branch of the United States. And this is important to keep in mind. This topic has come up quite a lot, especially during Trump's presidency, about the powers of the executive. Some people feeling like he's overreaching in his enforcement with different aspects of the executive branch, but it's important to remember that according to the Constitution, the entirety of those executive powers are vested in the President of the United States. So this is really a very, very powerful office. There's a reason they call it the most powerful office. Even as we talked about it, we talked about Article 1 is the Congress is supposed to be the most powerful, but that power is divided up over all those different people. In the executive branch, all of that power is given to one person, the president. And a lot of this comes to changing views of the executive branch over time. When it was first established, he was an administrator. We'll talk about this more later. But he was an administrative figure. His job was to apply the law. And so, he was enforcement of the law that Congress made. And so he had a lot of power, but that power was limited to what Congress said it was. As time has gone on, the presidency has expanded, grown greater and greater and greater, and so this executive power has grown more and more powerful. So what is an executive? The executive is the person who exercises our administrative or executive control. He carries out the decision. So if you imagine it as a company, the board of directors is the Congress. They make the rules, and then the CEO is the chief executive, literally CEO, chief executive officer. He's the one who takes that vision that the board of directors came up with and turns it into day-to-day action, activity, oversees what the business actually does. And it's the same in the United States. The legislative makes the laws, makes the rules, tells us what we're doing, what we're trying to do, but then it's the job of that president to actually carry those ideas into reality. So there's a number of constitutional powers. We're going to talk about a few of them: Commander-in-Chief, Chief Executive, Chief Diplomat, Legislative Leader. So Commander-in-Chief, this is Article 2, Section 2. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the President is in charge of those things. He is the Commander-in-Chief. Now, we already talked about, last time, we talked about this conflict. The President is the Commander-in-Chief, but the Congress has the power to declare war. We talked about the War Powers Resolution and how these interact and how it can be a bit confusing to figure out how these two go together. But basically, the President, if you look at the organizational chart of the military of the United States, the President is undoubtedly at the very top. He's the one ultimately everyone in the military answers to. He is also the chief executive. This means that he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This one has come into conflict quite a few times. So what this means is that whatever laws Congress makes, The president is supposed to execute. He's supposed to make sure that they actually happen. But this has become somewhat problematic as there's more laws and more things going on, and the president has gotten more power. The question of what exactly that means keeps on coming forward. Under Nixon, we had a situation where the Congress said a law had to take place and assigned money to it, and President Nixon said, okay, well, I'm just not going to allocate the money that Congress told me to this issue. Is that okay? The courts ultimately came in and said no. But we also see things like under President Obama with enforcement of immigration laws. We saw that President Obama created a robust system to allow people, dreamers as they're known, to stay in the country, even though the law of the United States said that they should be deported. Now, is he faithfully executing the laws? And the courts ultimately said yes, and they said yes because there are some other laws which gave him greater power in that regard. But this is a sort of ongoing issue as we have more laws and more priorities. Another great example is marijuana enforcement. In this country, the federal government has said marijuana is illegal. And there's some fairly stiff penalties for possession or distribution of marijuana on the federal level. There are also laws on the state level, but several states have backed off of that and said, we're going to allow possession, use, and distribution under certain channels of marijuana. And the president, we saw this under Obama, and then we're seeing it under Trump as well. The presidents, the executive branch has said, basically, for the most part, we are not going to execute these federal laws. We're not going to arrest people for marijuana possession because the states have said that they're okay with it. Now remember, these are two separate sovereigns. The president absolutely has the right to go in and arrest all of the distribution centers for marijuana. But they choose not to. Now, is that a violation of their oath under Article 2, Section 3? And that's a debate that comes up a lot. And there's not really a clear answer to it. For the most part, we just accept that the president has these power to set priorities. So while he is charged with executing the laws, he doesn't really have the resources to execute all of them. So we sort of nod and wink and say, yes, Mr. President, do what you can. President is the chief diplomat. He shall have the power and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. So what this means and how it's been interpreted is that the President of the United States is the voice to the world. Not the Senate, not individual congressmen, not representatives from the state of Texas or Alaska or wherever, but the president. He is the voice through his ambassadors and various diplomats. He is the voice of the United States. And this is an important thing to remember. What we don't want is a situation where other countries feel like the United States isn't trustworthy, where we're speaking with multiple voices. This actually came up during the Obama presidency very clearly when he was working towards a deal with Iran regarding their nuclear powers, their nuclear capabilities. Obama negotiated a treaty with them that involved lessening of financial sanctions on the country in exchange for them agreeing to stop developing nuclear weapons, to allow greater inspections. Republicans disagreed with the deal, and they said, you shouldn't do this, there's these problems with the deals, and we don't trust them, and we need to keep these penalties in place to make sure that they don't get too powerful. And Obama went forward with his plan. He issued into an executive agreement, not a treaty, but an executive agreement with Iran saying that we are going to release these sanctions and you're going to allow people to inspect and make sure you're not making nuclear weapons. And then the Republicans who controlled, they were in the House, the Republicans in the House sent a letter to Iran saying, don't enter into this agreement because as soon as we take control, we're going to back out of it. Now, this got a whole lot of attention. There were accusations of treason against the Republicans because under Article 2, Section 2, the president is the chief diplomat. But what Republicans pointed out very correctly is that while the president can negotiate, he has to have the advice and consent of the Senate to make a treaty and 2/3 of the votes of the senators, which Obama couldn't get. And so the end result was sort of this messy situation where Obama was making promises, but those promises only lasted for as long as he was in office, an executive agreement. And as soon as he went out of office and Trump took control, Republicans got rid of the agreement, and it created a whole lot of pain on the sort of international diplomatic scale as these sanctions were ramped back up. But going on behind the scenes of all of it was just this question of Article 2, Section 2. Can the president make agreements and bind the United States? Well, he has the power to talk to other people. He is our chief diplomat. But under Article 2, Section 2, it requires 2/3 of the senators to agree to any treaty that the president actually reaches. This became a big issue after World War I with the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson helped to develop the League of Nations after World War I. The whole idea was that the League of Nations would operate to stop World War II from happening. That we would create this organization where we could work together to make sure that the sort of horrors of the past never happened, that we never again had all of the European powers go to war with each other by having this open place for dialogue and to get rid of differences. And so Woodrow Wilson helped to create it, helped to come up with the basic items that formed this new League of Nations. He was a big supporter and got European powers to sign on to it, came back home, presented it to the U.S. Senate, and the U.S. Senate said no. 55 said yes, 39 said no. But it required 2/3, that super majority, to approve it. And so despite the fact that the United States was a leader in creating this League of Nations, we did not join the League of Nations. It wasn't until after the end of World War II, when the League of Nations failed, that it was replaced with the UN, and the United States signed on to that. Now, the president also is a legislative leader, and this is an interesting power. The powers of the legislative branch, the power to make law, is firmly vested in the Congress, in the House and the Senate, correct? But the president has some influence. See, he's the person on the ground. He, day to day, makes a decision, sees what's happening with the government. And so our founding fathers understood that that meant that he would have special insight into what was happening and what needed to happen. And so Article 2, Section 3 says, he, the president, shall from time to time give to the Congress information on the state of the Union and recommend for their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. What that means is that every so often, from time to time, it doesn't say how often, but from time to time, he needs to go to Congress and tell them what's really going on and recommend certain things that they should do. Now, he can't order them to do it. They're separate branches. But he gets to come over and sort of tell them, as the president, we're having a problem with this, this, and this. I need you to give more money here. I need you to pass a law letting me do this, etc., etc. It just makes sense. Now, this entire idea became much more formalized over time as the State of the Union Address. This became a regular event every year. Originally, the president would write it out as a letter and just send the letter, but once radio and then television came in, and it became more important for the president to be seen as a leader, he started doing it in person, these massive televised addresses, and these are called the State of the Union Addresses. There's a link to one of the State of the Unions. I think it's a 5-minute clip of the important parts of one of Obama's State of the Union addresses. So you can sort of see what they look like. And they're sort of, they've been referred to as the Super Bowl for nerds. Once a year, we sit around and we watch the president spell out what he thinks has happened this year, what was important, what we need to do moving forward. And it's very important for the president, for the Congress, for politics. These are very important parts, but it is interesting because it's required by the Constitution, but certainly not in the format that we imagine it. Now, when I have students in my class, I have them make their own State of the Union. I like this exercise, but of course, I'm not going to make you do it because we're all virtual this year. But it is kind of fun, especially right now as we're heading into a new election. You might want to take a couple of minutes and just think to yourself, if you were to talk about how the Union is doing right now, how our country is doing right now, what would you say? And then what would you prioritize moving forward for the next year for our country? What issues do you think need to be tackled? I like this exercise. Again, I'm not going to make you do it because it's fun. It takes up some good class time and really helps me get to know the students, but it just doesn't work in this format, and I'm not going to make you record yourself. Now, there's a couple of things that we need to understand, and these are interesting. So the president as a legislative leader. Now, we know that Congress passes a law. That it goes through the House, goes through the Senate, and then it goes to the president. The president can either sign it, or he can veto it, or he can do nothing. And we talked about that some. If he signs it, it becomes law. If he vetoes it, it goes back and can be overridden by the House and the Senate. If he does nothing and Congress is in session, then the bill goes away. If he does nothing and Congress is out of session, then the bill becomes law. Or is that the other way around? Either way, I forget what I said, but either way, you can look at it. So there's another thing he can do, and that he regularly does. And this is called the executive order or the signing statement. So we talked a little bit about executive orders. Executive orders, basically, a law has been passed, but the president wants to do something with it. He wants to tell the people who work for him how to actually do that law. So he issues an executive order. He tells the people who works for him, hey, yes, marijuana is illegal, but I am going to order you to not prioritize that. That unless there's some other offense that we're looking into, and this is part of it, otherwise we're just going to ignore on the federal level marijuana laws in states that have decided to legalize marijuana. That's an executive order. Now, executive orders can get really complicated because in theory, they're designed for the president to advise the people who work for him how to do their job. But that's not always how they've been used. We saw this start to pop up a lot under George W. Bush. Obama campaigned against it, then Obama did the same thing, and now Trump's doing the same thing, which is just the president basically issuing executive orders that do the opposite of what legislation says. The best example, and I talked about this earlier, one of the big examples is Obama with his immigration laws. The immigration laws said one thing, Obama said that's not workable, but he wasn't able to get Congress to make a solution. So instead, he just issued an executive order setting up the entire Dreamer system. Now, the problem is there was no legislation underlying that. In fact, the legislation said the opposite. It said, no, you have to deport these people. Now, everyone knew that was a bad solution, but they were able to rely upon the executive order. Then we saw when Trump came into power, there were legal challenges to the executive order. And it's very interesting when you look at the actual decisions from the court. What they said is that the president has the power to change that executive order. And that, of course, makes sense. An executive order only lasts for as long as the executive lasts. And this is one of the problems. When you pass a law, that law is law until the new law takes place or until it's overruled by something else. But with an executive order is the president issuing a directive to his employees on how to do their job. And so when a new executive comes into power, what happens to the old executive order? Well, the old executive order, it disappears. In fact, one of the things most presidents, we saw it under Obama, saw it under Trump, one of the first things they do is issue an executive order telling every executive agency to disregard all executive orders that were issued by the last president unless they're told otherwise. And so we see these executive orders as they keep on doing more and more important things like immigration reform. We see that it leads to a high level of uncertainty in our government. And this is one of the fundamental problems with executive orders. So the president will say, we need immigration reform. Congress won't be able to agree on immigration reform, so the president will create a comprehensive immigration system through an executive order. Then when he leaves office, a new president comes in and says, I don't like that immigration system, it's gone. Now what happened? Well, the millions of people who relied upon the former president saying, this is how we're going to do it, they're now out of luck. And in fact, the courts backed that up. The court said the president has the power to change those executive orders. The problem is, and the reason why they're still in force, is the court said that while the president has the power to change those executive orders, he has to actually do so. It gets more complicated, but basically the president argued that we were changing the law. I wasn't getting rid of it. I didn't really want to get rid of it, but the law wasn't constitutional. The courts looked at it and said, yes, it was, and your revocation of it was arbitrary and capricious. You didn't go through the right steps. But then it said, we recognize the fact that this is really a stopgap. The new president can issue a new executive order, getting rid of the old policy. And so, executive orders, very kind of complicated. You've heard me talk about them for a while. At their most simple, president issues an order, tells his people to do stuff. But it gets more complicated because can the president issue that order? For the most part, we've taken very broad views of executive order and the power of the president, even when the legislation doesn't really back him up to issue those. And secondly, what happens when that president leaves? Well, those executive orders die. And so they're sort of a stopgap, and they're really a recognition of the fact that lately the legislative branch has not been plugging the holes. Now, we talked about the legislative branch is supposed to be kind of slow, but it's also supposed to respond to emergencies. As in recent decades, the legislative branch has really become paralyzed. They've stopped doing much legislating on important issues because any vote they make is then used against them. It's become too highly politicized to the point where you can't get anything done. And they've really started to rely upon the president taking over with executive orders to handle these holes that open up in the system. And so this is problematic. You sort of get into which came first, the chicken or the egg. Did the executive order come in and replace Congress making laws, or did Congress stop making laws and so the executive order was necessary? But either way, it's really not how a democracy is supposed to work. Frequently when you hear people say that the president is ruling through fiat, through order, they're referring to these executive orders. There's another thing the president can do, which is a signing statement. This one really drove people crazy back when W was president. Basically, what happens is the president signs a bill into law, and frequently they'll issue a signing statement, a little statement attached to it that says, this is what I believe this law means. And that's the whole idea. That's how it's supposed to work. It's sort of like an executive order, just attached to it, just a little note from the president saying, as I sign this, I understand it to mean this. These things are unclear. We started to see under W, he would sign bills, and as part of his signing statement say, I see Section 5 as unconstitutional and I won't enforce it. And then we're seeing the same sort of thing, is that the presidents now will sign a bill into law, and as they sign it, they'll attach a signing statement literally saying the opposite of the bill. The bill will say, do A, and they say, well, we're going to do X instead. And that's not really what a signing statement is for, but at the same time, for the most part, presidents are allowed to get away with that. Appointment. Appointment is a major power of the president. This is the power, so every time a president comes into office, there are about 6,000 federal positions that need to be filled. These are, things like some of them are as small as like postmaster in a local community, person in charge of the local post office. Some of them are Supreme Court judges. So very big difference in how important they are. And all of these, the president is responsible for filling, all 6,000 of them. And so this becomes a major issue, a major battleground. You want the person who fills the position. Most normal people not in government, think the person who fills the position should probably be somebody who's passionate about that subject. For example, if you're filling the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, if you're filling the head of that, you really want somebody who's maybe an environmental lawyer, who really understands the law and the realities of what's going on so they can do it. However, presidents will normally fill those offices with political figures, people who will enforce their image. So, for example, there's been complaints against the Trump administration. For example, the Postmaster General is not a big fan of the post office. The head of the education for the Secretary of Education for the U.S. Is an advocate for private schools. And so there's, that sort of issue where the president gets to determine who they choose to put into that position really can change the direction of the office in some ways that we might not always agree with. Now, one important one, ambassadors. We have basically people on the ground in foreign countries. They are at the embassies, and their job is responsible for being our voice in that country. They're our direct contact. We appoint someone as the ambassador to England. They live in England in a special diplomatic compound. They go and talk with the government of England. When something happens, they talk to him. They really act as our sort of boots on the ground, and we do that all over. These are our ambassadors. And the president is responsible for appointing these ambassadors. So imagine for a second, take a step back, and imagine that you were the president. How would you choose who would be the envoy to France? Now, most likely, the way you do it, and the way most countries in the world do it, is they have a permanent diplomatic corps. These are people who are career diplomats. They join out of college, out of getting their master's, whatever, and they develop a specialization in a country or group of countries, make sure they learn the language on the ground. They'll go and live there as part of the ambassador staff for a large portion of their life, and then when the ambassador retires, one of them will be appointed to fill the position. These people who have dedicated their lives to understanding that country. In the U.S., we always make the ambassador to various countries. They're people who contribute the most money to the president's election campaign. There's these people called bundlers. So there's limits on how much money any person can give to the presidential campaign. And so then there's these people called bundlers. And bundlers, literally what they do is they take a bunch of contributions, they put them together into a big pile, and then they come up and give them to the president. In exchange for getting all that money together, the president gives them favor. And one of the main ways they do this is giving them a good ambassadorship. And so what happens is frequently we have ambassadors to foreign countries who don't speak the language, have never been there before, or have only been there on vacation, and really are incapable of doing much. And this is a system, it's a little bit of a black eye. It's certainly not new for Trump. We saw it under basically every preceding president. It's been the system for a long time, but it is something of an embarrassment that that's how we continuously do it. Okay, veto power. Like we talked about, the president can veto bills after they pass both houses of Congress. I like to mention there's no line item veto in the United States, in the federal government. What that means is that you either veto the bill entirely, or you let the bill become law entirely. You can't pick out sections of it. Now, interestingly, in the state of Texas, the governor has the veto, and the governor has a line item veto for appropriations, which means that he can go in and any amount of money the government's going to spend on something, he can reduce that amount of money. The U.S. president cannot do so. There is no line item veto. So if a bill comes in and it's 90% good and 10% bad, the president has to choose, do I accept the 10% bad or do I get rid of it entirely? And so that's a big issue. A lot of the times we talk about bills and we like to kind of play gotcha with elected officials like, you voted yes on HB 256 and that involved in eating babies. Well, if that was buried in, subsection 17, clause 6, put on by the ambassador from wherever, some little part of it, and 99% of the bill was good. And unfortunately in the U.S., that's how it works. We end up with these multi-thousand-page bills with amendments that have nothing to do with the underlying bill. And so the president doesn't have the power to line out a veto. He can't pull things out. Now, if the president does veto it, as we talked, that it can go back to the House and Senate, and they can do, if 2/3 of the congressmen and senators agree, then they can override the veto and the bill will become the law anyway. Rarely happens. When it happens, it's a big black eye for the president. It really tells the president you're out of step on that issue and you need to take another look at this. Override, when a veto gets overridden, it really is something that is an embarrassment for the president. Okay, presidential pardon. We're going to have a little bit of an exercise I'm going to have you work through as our third video today on the presidential pardon. But the presidential pardon is interesting. The president has the power to restore all rights and privileges of citizenship for a specific individual charged or convicted of a crime. So what that means is that if somebody does something illegal, if somebody breaks a federal law, then the president can say, yes, you did it, but I'm going to pretend and the country's going to pretend like you didn't. Now, this is important to understand because federal courts have said that in order for it to be a pardon, the person has to actually recognize that the crime actually took place. You actually have to have committed a crime. You can't say, I didn't do anything wrong, I didn't break the law, but pardon me anyway. You're saying, when you accept the pardon, you're saying, yes, I broke this law, but you need to pardon me. And so the president can do that. The president can reach out. And this is really a check on the legislative and judicial branches. It's the ability to say, yes, he violated a law that was written. Yes, the courts properly applied the law to the facts and found this person was guilty. But for whatever reason, and there really is no limit on this presidential power, for whatever reason, I'm going to find that this individual should have all of his rights and privileges restored. He should be allowed to just go back to normal life as though he hadn't hadn't done the crime. So a person must acknowledge the crime took place. That's important. Like I said, you can't be in a situation where you can maintain that you didn't do the crime but get a pardon anyway. You did the crime if you were pardoned for it. If you didn't do the crime, there's no pardon. You can also, the president has given amnesty to classes of people. For example, after the Vietnam War, President Carter gave amnesty for people who refused to sign up for the draft. So that was a question at the time. There was this very large group of people who had fled the country, refused to show up when their draft number was called. What was going to happen to those people? Because that's a federal crime. And so what was going to happen to those people? Were they all going to be arrested? And Carter issued a blanket pardon for all of them, said, no, we're just going to move forward. Now, it is important to note that this is for federal crimes only, and this has actually come up recently. So the president has the power to pardon federal crimes. So remember, we have a federalist system. So that means there are two sovereigns, right? There are the states, and there is the central government. Two separate sovereigns. So the president has the power to pardon federal crimes, but not state crimes. States still have the power to pardon those. Similarly, the governor can pardon state crimes, but not federal crimes. Now, as the federal government has gotten bigger and bigger, a lot of things that are federal crimes are now also state crimes. So this can lead to the situation where the president will pardon an individual for a federal offense, and the state will decide to go forward with prosecution. This issue, and it hasn't actually come up exactly yet, but there's been a lot of talk about this with our current president and his potential for pardoning people who worked with him on things that some people are saying were illegal. When he pardons these people, that might not be the end of it for him, for that individual. The states, especially New York, seem to be indicating that they will move forward. If there's grounds for criminal charges in New York, they will move forward with prosecuting this individual in New York, regardless of if the president pardoned them in the federal system. So it is interesting. There's a couple of terms in the pardon system that we don't normally think about. Budget. So the president is responsible for spending the federal money. So the president is responsible for preparing a budget. He tells the Congress how much he needs, but the Congress has that power of the purse, specifically as we talked about the House. Appropriations bills begin in the House. So the president prepares a budget, tells the legislature how much he needs. The House and the Senate then pass a budget. So the president is very important in the budget. However, it is up to Congress to pass the budget. We talked about the Congressional Budget Office that Congress created, so they don't have to worry as much about the president and his positions. They can get independent information. Okay, that's where we're stopping with video 1. We'll be back in a minute for video 2.